Good morning. So I'm going to talk to you today about ethics. All anthropologists should think about ethics. What is ethics? Yeah. Ethics and anthropology. So all of the critiques of colonialism and anthropologists and power, reflexivity, and so on really had to do with bias. But controversies about some idea of truth or the focus of men on women or gender or neutrality really got blown out the window when we started to talk about anthropologists and war, especially the war in Vietnam. Vietnam and the American War, as you call it, really changed anthropology, like to an extent that not enough people talk about how fundamental the transformation in anthropology in the 1960s was because of Vietnam. And I want to talk about that today. The development of ethical codes, which are rules about how anthropologists should behave, can be traced back to the work of anthropologists in Vietnam. When I say the work of anthropologists, I should really say the work of CIA and Rand Corporation pretending they were anthropologists, or anthropologists working in the employment of Rand Corporation. Now, you don't hear much about Rand Corporation now, except maybe that they developed the internet, okay? But that was a later version of Rand. Their initial big contracts were with the US military to do work on knowledge industries in Vietnam, which meant spying, which meant interrogation, which meant torture. So when you read the Association of American Anthropologists guidelines, it doesn't say anything about Vietnam, but you have to read it with some background knowledge. That when anthropologists like Marshall Sahlins, in this chapter of a book called Anthropologists and the Public Sphere, Marshall Sahlins traveled to Vietnam in 1965. When Americans who were not part of the war effort came to Vietnam and went to Hanoi, it was a big thing, right? Jane Fonda and another anthropologist I'll talk about in a bit, Kathleen Goff, but Marshall Sahlins, he came in 1965. Now, he came sponsored by an organization that had supported his teachings. You should know what a teaching is because the student movement in protests worldwide, they will often use the protest practice of a teaching, which means you have a day off classes and you have a protest, but inside the protest you have the teachers give classes anyway. So you protest, you don't miss your schooling, but but the topics will be very different. The first teachings were by this guy, Marshall Sahlins. I don't think he really invented them, but he's given the credit for it because he's the famous one. But certainly at his university, He was leading teach-ins, and this was a part of the anti-Vietnam War, as it was known in America, anti-Vietnam War student mobilization. So they would refuse to go to classes and instead have demonstrations against American involvement in Vietnam, and they would have teach-ins, like to teach in about what was happening in the war. I will pass this around, you can have a quick look. What Marshall Salins does in this chapter, he visited Vietnam and he met with some American soldiers who were, let's say, 2 times, practiced in the art of interrogation. Interrogation, right? Interviewing, torturing people for information. And this is the record of his interview. You can look at the other chapters in there. They're quite important and good. The United Kingdom Anthropological Association, Association of Social Anthropologists, they have also some ethical guidelines developed a little bit later, and many professional groups nowadays produce ethical guidelines. Like, well, I suppose ethical guidelines go back to the Greeks and the Hippocratic oath that doctors take. We will always be in the interest of the patient, whatever the Hippocratic oath is. But other lobby groups, like even boring ones like the National Association of Accountants, or probably even automobile manufacturers, they have ethical guidelines. Social work, for example, have ethical guidelines. So in anthropology, this discussion must also apply to how we produce so-called knowledge. So why should you know about guidelines? I guess the principle is something like, do no harm, not to use knowledge to harm the interests of any people, to damage cultural activity. Whether you are involved in writing the history or story of some Trobriand village, you should have some guidelines to make sure that you are not crossing boundaries. Now we can go back and look in the past at anthropology and see that many anthropologists did cross boundaries. Slept with local women, stole from local people, sat in their tents eating good food while outside people were hungry. Colin Turnbull and the Ick, for example. The Ick were starving and he was sitting inside his Land Rover scoffing food. But even in contemporary times, like in tourism studies, or working in the tourism sector even, or in museums, thinking about how you display cultural artifacts. You need some kind of guidelines. I suppose there is some kind of student charter or guidelines. We certainly developed them, and we talk about a lot about them in my other course, Critical Thinking, about the university and its rules and regulations. Of course, I think guidelines are there to be challenged, always, but still. Is it ethical guidelines? Is it about if you have ethical guidelines in your organization, is that about doing the right thing or not getting into trouble? That's the question about ethics. Is it ethical to do whatever you do? In the case of anthropologists, for example, now we think don't take money from corporations, don't take money from the military because that will compromise you. But really, I think quite often the other side of it is ethical guidelines are there because the organization doesn't want to get into trouble, wants to avoid controversy. And we'll discuss this. Of course, knowledge about anything has impact, has effect. Whether you are a participant, a combatant in a battle, or a bystander, or just viewing from afar, the status of knowledge has consequences. Let's try and work this out. The consequences might not have impact until much later. This man, anyone know who this is? Okay, you are doing a course in anthropology in Vietnam. You probably should know the most famous Vietnamese anthropologist. Yeah? What's his name? Without looking it up on Google, you've got to have it in your memory. Here's his book, George Condominos, this man. Mother Vietnamese, father French, but he wrote this book. This amazing book, actually. It's kind of like a diary. Okay? He worked in a village called Saluk with the Montagnards. These are people that went over to the side of the French, the side of the Americans, Highlanders who fought against the communists. But he worked with them. On the back, there's an endorsement from Claude Lévi-Strauss. So high praise. And this book, it's really amazing. It tells the story mostly of sitting around with the Highland people in the 1940s, 1950s, drinking a lot. I mean, when I read this, I felt, yeah, this is impossible to do this kind of fieldwork now because of my liver. They drink a lot, but Condominos' book, We Have Eaten the Forest. Now, the point is, he wrote this book in the 1950s. 1957, right? And it tells the story of what life is like in the Highlands, in the Central Highlands. But this book, as we'll see, had it tells the story of the village. It tells the story of the culture. But its impact in terms of knowledge was much wider than just telling us about the Highlanders. This became a document in the war. You can't tell from looking at it. You can pass it around. Please be careful with the cover. So when I think of guidelines in anthropology, this book is the thing that comes to mind and must be thought of. Why? We'll see. Right, this study, a good ethnography, I mean, please, in the history of anthropology, there are good and bad ethnographies. This is one of the really good, detailed studies, right? It combines anecdotal evidence with historical material, with textual evaluation reports. It's really quite engaged. But what happened? In 1961, this is the key point. In 1961, unknown to George Condominos, he did not know about this, the CIA have translated his book. The Central Intelligence Agency of the USA translate his book without him knowing, and they use that knowledge to help them convince the Montagnard, the people in Saluk and other places, to convince the tribal people to fight with the Americans. They use that book to learn about how to communicate, how to do the right ritual, do the right greetings, do the right approach to these people to get them to think that the Americans were okay and we will help them in the war. They used the book as like a guidebook. Right? So like if you're an American, you know what Americans are like. You enter into the highlands, probably you're going to, if you're not very careful, you're going to offend someone. But because they had read this book, they knew what to do. They knew how to respect the people. Now we have a long history of anthropologists working for the war effort. I've talked about Evans Pritchard and World War II. I can tell you about, I think I already mentioned, the work of Ruth Benedict. Ruth Benedict, she wrote about Japan to help the Americans in their war effort against Japan, against the Japanese, and the American occupation of Japan after the war. This book, Patterns of Culture, is like a guidebook for Americans to understand what is it about Japanese culture. The weird thing is that Ruth Benedict did not visit Japan. She did not do field work. She just used the historical records and reports. And now this one, of all books of anthropology, is translated into Ting Viet. You can also look at this one. But this was in World War II. And in this one, Ruth Benedict knew she was working for the military. Like she did it on purpose. There are other cases. During the American War, there was an institute called the Tribal Research Center in Thailand, in Chiang Mai. I visited it, Chiang Mai. The Tribal Research Center was staffed by quite a number of anthropologists from Sydney, from Australia. And they did work on the highlands, also to help with the war effort. by understanding Vietnamese and Lao culture, they could try to understand what made the communists how they were. And this would inform the military. The one instance I heard of is in a seminar in Sydney. They were looking at where the support camps for the Ho Chi Minh Trail would be located. They wanted to bomb them. And the anthropologists from the Tribal Research Center could advise that you don't bomb the top of the mountain or the bottom of the mountain, you have to aim for the side of the mountain, because that's where the villages will be, that's where those who are women mostly who are transporting goods along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, that's where they will stay. So they used anthropology to guide their attacks. Ruth Benedict's Japanese so-called ethnography was used to help the Americans, to guide them in their war effort and in their occupation after the war. So anthropology's involvement in war research was recognized by the Anthropological Association of America, but the discussions with Margaret Mead and so on really didn't have huge impact until in 1968 the CIA actually advertised in a journal, a newsletter of anthropology, asking for recruits, anthropologists to work for them in Vietnam. And then anthropologists like Eric Wolf, who was the head of the AAA, and Kathleen Goff and Marshall Salins got very agitated. And they invited George Condominos. They invited George Condominos to give a talk to the annual meeting of the Association of Anthropologists of America, American Anthropological Association, sorry. And George came to give that talk, and he revealed in that talk that he had just found out that that book, you can pass it around, was translated by the CIA and used by the CIA without his knowledge. Kind of shocking. And the anthropologists of the AAA, they were upset at this. How could an anthropologist's work, which was such a nice ethnography and seemingly harmless, now be used by the military and have terrible effects? How could good knowledge, a lovely story of the tribal life, done by an anthropologist who was an insider, right, he's Vietnamese, now be used by the US military against that country? People were upset and shocked and kind of didn't. I mean, of course, all knowledge can be used for any kind of purpose. You find out what you want to do, then you use the knowledge to do it, no matter what. But George's book is not the only example, though, of Rand Corporation anthropology. Rand employed a number of anthropologists, Donald Hickey and others, and in fact, they produced this amazing and terrifying book, a big fat volume called The Minority Groups of the Republic of Vietnam. This book, which is a compendium of all the tribal groups, all the ethnic groups, all the minorities, whatever you want to call them, in Vietnam. the Jarai, the Raglai, you name it, Mayo. But this book, which I bought in a second-hand bookstore here, right? It's available. It was used in Vietnam, and this is a bit old, but all right, I open it up, February 1966. Minority Groups in the Republic of Vietnam Ethnographic Study Series. I thought, oh, fantastic, anthropology book. I want to teach this. That they built about the 54 minorities of Vietnam. I already see that this volume was prepared by the Cultural Information Analysis Center, CINFAC, Center for Research in Social Systems, CRESS, of the American University. Okay. Most books come from an institution, no problem. It was designed to be useful to military and other personnel who need a convenient compilation of basic facts about the social, economic, and political institutions and practice of minority groups in the Republic of Vietnam. The book is designed to help the military. Okay, I don't like that sort of thing, but we've heard of that in anthropology before. I keep on reading. The American University, all effort has been to make this study comprehensive. This study, now in the preface, this study was prepared in response to a request from the Directorate of Special Operations, Office of the Deputy Chief of Staff for Military Operations, Department of the Army. What is an Office of Special Operations? Special Ops. The Green Beret, the CIA military wing. This book was prepared for them. Sure, we've always had anthropologists involved in war, and we studied, we read, remember Evans Pritchard. And Evans Pritchard even tells you his war stories like anecdotes. They're like, yeah, back in the war, you know, we were heroes and we went and fought. Like and even in methodology, Evans Pritchard will tell his stories as if they were anecdotes. This is how you do field work. And he will tell an anecdote about what happened to him. Stay off the quinine, stay off the women, take lots of quinine, right? There wasn't much in the way of talk of methodology, advice for an anthropologist what to do. But this book gives advice. This book gives advice not just to anthropologists, but to the military. It's a guidebook, how to do guerrilla warfare, counterinsurgency warfare. It's a different order of book to Evans Pritchard. Much more dangerous. Sure, Malinowski, we had right-wing anthropologists too. He was against the Bolshevik, against the communists. He wanted to do anthropology in Africa to stop communism in Africa, the black Bolshevik. Okay? His wife was against the anti-conscription movement in Australia because she thought that was a conspiracy coming from Moscow. He was really the white man among the... But while no discipline is exempt from the politics of knowledge, corporate sector influence, militarism, And nowadays, environmental audits in tourism, they are manipulated so that the project can go ahead. For heritage development, we do studies to enable things to go forward. We do market research to find out how to sell products. Market research is not research, right? You know that. It's advertising. Another way of doing advertising. But it makes us think about what anthropologists do. Sometimes they do advertising or military research. We can talk about anthropologists trying to improve work conditions, improve the lot of the indigenous people, or to fight for their rights. But more often than not, their work is used, like the work of Condominas, to help projects that anthropologists did not intend. Maybe people are naive about knowledge, to think that knowledge is somehow neutral or free. We have a philosophy about this, from texts about this, endless numbers of them. Maybe one would be Jürgen Habermas, knowledge and human interest. Your investment in something, your interest in something will make that knowledge valuable. Like, let's not think that university teaching programs are here just because we think it's a really good idea that we study sociology. No, someone wants to do something with that sociology. We're talking about a new media BA starting next year. We had a meeting last night about it. Why? Not because we think, well, I think, but not only because we think that it's good to study media, but because there is a demand in the market for people trained in media. There is a demand in the market that we try to service. Knowledge is interested. It's invested in some outcome. So the UK as an association is rethinking its ethical guidelines right now, updating them for contemporary times. In 2011, they said the ASA seeks to encourage anthropologists to think about ethical implications of their work in a profound and continuous way. An ethical approach most centrally avoids causing harm. Isn't the Google slogan also, or the Amazon slogan? No, the Google slogan, do no harm. Yeah. Avoid causing harm to our subjects by what we do in the field or write about them, and ideally ensures a reciprocal exchange of benefits. This requires much more than ticking off a checklist of do's and don'ts. Risk assessment and dealing with uncertainties about consequences must be ongoing and relevant to often dynamic context. Well, the dynamic context for this book was the war. And what did this book do? Let me read to you a little bit from it. I'm just picking, all right, to make sure it's completely objective, pick a page, just open anywhere, okay? We are with section 11, communication techniques. All right, good. They have a section called civic action considerations. This will be a study of, which tribe are we looking at? We are looking at this group. Some nice pictures of huts, longhouses, and so on. They are the Rade. Okay? In the Rade, they have civic action considerations. Here are some guidelines for civic action. That means social behavior. Doing projects for the village. Projects originating in the local village are more desirable than suggestions imposed by a remote central government. That seems obvious, yes? Projects should be designed to be challenging, but should not be on such a scale as to intimidate the villagers. What? That implies that villagers are a bit childlike. Projects should have a fairly short completion period so you can show a result quickly. Okay, understand that one. Results should be as far as possible observable, measurable, or tangible. Projects should ideally lend themselves to emulation by other villages or groups. That's amazing, emulation, right? Emulation is a word that belongs also to Ho Chi Minh. All right, I turn the page, one page from where you chose. Right, just one page from where you chose over. You chose that page. The next page, tell us about the Rade paramilitary capabilities. The Rade may be useful as informers, intelligence agents, propaganda agents, labor for the services, trackers and guides, interpreters, translators, and as self-defense forces, in addition to use in organized counter-guerrilla combat units. This is an anthropology book saying that the tribal people can be recruited to the US Army, and this is how to do it. In addition to their familiarity with the local terrain, they know the ground and environment, the Rade have considerable stamina and are capable of sustained long-range cross-country marches in this difficult terrain. They are skilled in the use of various hunting weapons, such as crossbows, knives, spears, traps, and snares. They are now trained to use modern weapons and equipment. Rade were trained by the colonial French forces. Reportedly, they are excellent soldiers. Those with the French army training are likely to be capable of sophisticated combat operations. Many Rade have also been trained by US personnel and are familiar with US operation techniques as well as modern equipment. The ability of the Rade to accept and absorb military instruction is limited to some extent by the generally low level of education. However, the factors mentioned above seem sufficiently significant to warrant attempts to develop greater receptivity to instruction. This book is saying that the Rade should be recruited to the war effort on the part of the Americans. It even shows some pictures of their weapons. And this book does this for every tribe, every minority, every village group. It goes through all the different minorities and says, what are the possibilities of using them for the military? The next section, suggestions for personnel working with the Rade. How to work with them. Terms of address. The term of address given outsiders in tribal areas is the one for grandfather, Ong, I suppose. Outsiders wishing to attend a Rade ceremony, festival, or meeting should request permission. An outsider should never enter a Rade house unless accompanied by a member of the house. Should not photograph them. Outsiders should not get involved with Rade women. Evans Pritchard, don't touch the women. Health and welfare is on. Some of the sections talk about political organization. Some of the minority groups are closely aligned with the communists, and so they are described. For example, the North Vietnamese have influenced the Hmong to the extent that they reportedly have provided some tribesmen with technical education in North Vietnam. They also have some influence upon the Viet Cong policies regarding tribal people. So this book goes through every minority. You can also look at this one. Goes through every minority and tells the American soldiers which minority groups will be sympathetic to working with them and which ones are probably communist. This is shocking that anthropology could do this. This is worse than translating Condominus's book because this was intentional. Anthropologists were employed to do this work. Now, We have guidelines that say do no harm. This guideline is about absolutely doing harm. Getting involved in the war. Pass the other one around. So, you have to ask yourself this question. If you are doing research, how can this research harm someone? Of course, the situation, uncertain consequences are ongoing and relevant. I mean, there's so many different factors, but if you do research on any topic, you need to think, could someone use this research against the people? For example, I do research on diaspora, right, on migrant groups. What harm could come to migrant groups from my research? If I wrote about them and said this migrant group are trying so hard to get into England or something that they will do some illegal activities, maybe I stop them from doing that because that alerts the police to their action, rather than exposing the police as a reason for people having to get into refrigerated trucks and travel across the border risking their life. As if it's the blame of the people rather than the blame of the system that makes it impossible to get to England. But to intentionally write your anthropology planning to do harm to people, that's something else. There's another person who was big in the discussion in the Anthropological Association of America development of guidelines. And that person is Kathleen Goff. Because Kathleen Goff helped write the guidelines which said anthropologists should not work for the military, should not work for Rand Corporation, should not work for the CIA. And it must be said, Rand Corporation did eventually stop doing this kind of work. Whether or not that excuses them, I don't know, I don't think so. But Rand Corporation did stop helping the American effort in Vietnam. But Kathleen Goff, the anthropologist, came as a guest because she did so much work to change the way in which anthropology was done in Vietnam. The new government of Vietnam after 1975, the national government of all of Vietnam, invited her for a tour of Vietnam as a guest. And she wrote a diary, this book, 10 times more beautiful, about the rebuilding of Vietnam after the war. She came as a guest. So an anthropologist can do good work in Vietnam as well, of course. Kathleen Goff should be acknowledged more in the history of anthropology, but she's not really. Quite a lot of people have forgotten about how important her work was. Mostly she worked in India. So the question is, how should knowledge be used? How should knowledge be used? Do you write an innocent book like Condominus's one Do you write a biased book like the Minority Report? Or do you write a book that helps people understand what is going on in the country, like Kathleen Goff does? Okay, let's look at the guidelines. The Association of Social Anthropologists guidelines tell us that we should not do a checklist, but we do have some checklists. Do you have consent? Here's a big question. I'm asking you for your final to think about how you will do field work. Right? Inspired by your chosen anthropologist, how will you do field work? What I'm really asking you to think about is, if you did field work, no matter what kind of field work it is, the people you work with, will they agree with your work? Will they give you consent? Say I wanted to do a study of students in my class. I should ask you, is it okay to write about you? I'm not going to. I've done it before already. Thank you. It worked. They're stopping. No? If I'm going to record the Google Classroom, I have to ask consent. But what if my study was of someone like the right wing, fascist? Do I need to ask their consent? They will say, no, you are some left-wing Marxist. I'm not going to let you. It's not so obvious that you can just tick off the textbook checklist. Non-exploitation at the time and later. Could my study be used at some time in the future to exploit the people that I wrote about? I'm asking you to think about that. If your study, if you were going to do an imaginary study, could your knowledge be used at some later time by, I don't know who, the government, Trump, the CIA, the tax inspector, okay? So many possibilities. The ASA also say we should have care for animals. We should cite and credit ownership of cultural ideas and knowledge. I totally agree with that one. The person whose labor it is to produce a text should get acknowledgement. They say you should have transparency and that people you write about should be anonymous. That's a bit difficult sometimes. I mean, if you are studying, like if you're writing about some village in the highlands, yeah, you can make your subjects anonymous. But what if you're doing an anthropology of the political system of a whole country? I mean, we're not always only studying small villages. You can't be anonymous about political leaders or about the leaders of a university or something like that. Each case, what the ASA mentions, there are competing and even contradictory aspects to it. Competing duties, obligations, and conflicts of interest. We have to negotiate. A big one now, because hardly any universities will fund an anthropologist to do fieldwork, is where the funding comes from. And then, if the funding comes from government or from a company, what say do they have in the knowledge? Most companies want to own that knowledge. There's a really big issue. sometimes anthropologists who get funded to do field work, say for a company wanting to make a hydroelectrical dam in the forest in Sarawak, a real case, they will get the anthropologist, Rousseau, to sign a non-disclosure agreement to say that the ethnography that he produced won't be published but will be given to the company. Can an anthropologist accept that? That their knowledge will never be made publicly available? And of course, government control. Are there some topics you should not look at? And that's really quite common everywhere, that there are some things people say, no, 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 don't look at that. It's going to be too difficult. You shouldn't touch that one, they say. Too sensitive a topic, like perhaps minorities in Vietnam. I don't know. There are lots of aspects of knowledge that are controversial. So the guidelines are supposed to make you think about that. The one about animals is really interesting. What do we do about animals? The guidelines say we should not harm animals. But what if the people you study are meat eaters? Right? It's not like you can do a vegetarian anthropology. What if the people you study are really into, well, think of the Sundarbans in West Bengal. Okay, in West Bengal, the delta, like the Mekong Delta, but much more forested because there hasn't been economic development. The Sundarbans are a place where there are still tigers. And the influence of the International World Wildlife Fund and the international charities that look after animals has been to protect the tigers and the forests for the tigers to the detriment of people. So that the government have even supported pushing the people out of these areas where they come to live, largely because they're migrants they're on the border between Bangladesh and India, and they want to live in this area, but India wants to get funding from the World Wildlife Fund and so protect the tiger. The tiger is the symbol of, we've got some tigers. Right, the tiger is a symbol of some political parties in West Bengal and is the symbol of India in so many ways. But in the Sundarbans, the tiger is being protected to the detriment of people. Tiger habitats are protected like national parks, and people who live there have been forced out by the military. They're migrants. So you can see the works in the Sundarbans the tiger is fantastic, no question about it. I do love the Bengal tiger, and we should protect the Bengal tiger. But in the Sundarbans, we should also protect people. And people have always lived in the environment with the tiger. Yes, sure, afraid of the tiger, and the tiger eats people occasionally, but not that much until they have been forced into a smaller and smaller area. Not like the animals in the delta for here, well, that's different. We can think about Karl Marx, and animals as well, and ask the question of what is animals' contribution to value? And we work with animals all the time. In fact, we have a symbiotic relationship with animals. We need to think about that. That's an ethical question as well, like a really deeper ethical question, not how to behave, but what is a human's relationship to animals in the world? Right now, for example, you have thousands of animals, creatures inside your belly digesting your breakfast. Without having these foreign, not part of you, but alien bacteria and creatures consuming, helping degrade and your bodily process, you would not survive. Without bees, for example, you know, there's been a lot of talk about a thing called colony collapse syndrome. You know about this? I have to write that one on the board. Who's heard of this? Has anyone heard of colony collapse syndrome? So we have industrialized animals and insects even in big farms in America, in Germany, for example. The farmland is not just left to nature. The farmers need to intervene in nature to have the processes work. For example, to pollinate the flowers of the wheat, they need bees to come and move from one plant to another to pollinate and germinate new crops. But because industrial farming is on such a huge scale, there are no longer enough bees in each area to do that work. So American or German or Australian farmers put bees on huge trucks and ship them to different farms, one farm 1 week, one farm the next week, to pollinate the crops. We've industrialized nature, right? But because these bees are being moved around so much, and perhaps because of aerosols or perhaps because of telephone networks, we don't know, the bees have been getting lost. The bees have been released from their trucks in the hives that are in the trucks, and they can't find their way back to the colony. So the colony collapses. The bees are brought to a farm. They're supposed to go out, pollinate the flowers, and then come back to the hive. But they're not coming back. And so thousands of millions of bees have died in America. Why is this a crisis? If we don't have bees pollinating crops, tell me, what are the consequences? If we don't have bees pollinating crops, what happens? What do we lose? Not just honey, but all vegetables. You should have this turned off, right? All vegetables will be lost. If bees die out, which they're in danger of doing with colony collapse, vegetables cannot grow because vegetables require bees to pollinate. The basic birds and bees, right? If the bees can't take the pollen from one plant to another, there can't be germination of another crop. If there's no vegetables, we have not much to eat. We can eat the cows, right? The cows are going to die out because they can't eat the grass, so we better eat them. But we also won't be able to make cotton. Without bees, no cotton, no shirts. So the cows are going to die out because we're going to have to eat them, because they're going to die because there's no bees to make the grass for the cows to live. So we won't be able to wear leather. We won't be able to wear cotton. The whole of our system is built on a relationship with animals. And if we lose that, we lose everything. So colony collapse syndrome is a really serious thing. There is research going on to find out why these colonies are collapsing. Some people say aerosols, the sprays used for herbicide and so on. Some people are saying it's the phone networks, the Wi-Fi and radio networks of telephone, 5G, 4G, is interfering with the homing navigation of bees. But in the Sundarbans, it's the tiger. Humans are being pushed back because of the tiger, because we are forgetting that humans have a symbiotic relationship with animals. Anyway, we'll leave it. This is halfway. Have a break for 10 minutes, and I'll stop the recording. And we'll talk more about specifically ethics programs, guidelines after the break. Thank you.